The summer Nathaniel Boyd turned 43, the bank sent him a letter he read 3 times before he let himself believe it. His electric bill for the well pumps alone had climbed past what he cleared some months on the whole farm, and the man from the co-op had already told him twice that a rate hike was coming in the fall. Nathaniel folded the letter, set it under the sugar bowl on the kitchen table, and went out to check the fence line like nothing had happened. That was his way. He didn't announce trouble. He just started walking toward whatever might fix it. Within a week, neighbors up and down the county road noticed something strange. Nathaniel Boyd, a man everyone had always known to keep a tidy, unremarkable farm, had started driving his old flatbed truck out to the recycling center in the next town over every Tuesday morning. He'd come back with the bed loaded down with cracked solar panels, the kind big commercial operations toss out when a few cells go bad, or a storm cracks the glass. Some were scorched at the corners. Some had frames bent from hail. A few looked like they'd been run over. He hauled them home, stacked them against the side of his barn, and said nothing to anybody about why. Word travels fast in a small farming community, and it wasn't long before the gas station crowd had a running joke about it. Old Boyd's collecting trash again. Somebody said he must be building a chicken coop out of glass. Somebody else said maybe he'd lost his mind out there alone since his wife passed. They weren't cruel about it, not exactly. It was the kind of laughter that comes easy when you don't understand what you're looking at, the kind that assumes if it made sense, somebody would have already done it. Nathaniel heard the talk. He always heard the talk. He'd hear it secondhand from the feed store clerk, who'd hear it from somebody's cousin, who'd heard it standing in line at the diner. Small counties work that way. A man can't sneeze without 3 other households knowing about it by supper. But he just kept driving to the recycling center every Tuesday. And by the middle of summer, he had close to 60 broken and half-broken solar panels stacked against that barn wall, more wattage sitting in scrap condition than some small operations run when everything's working. He hadn't spent more than the price of gas and a few 6-packs he traded to the recycling center manager for first pick of the pile. And still, he hadn't told a soul what he was planning, not even his daughter. The recycling center manager, a heavy-set, easy-going man named Fred Talley, had taken a liking to Nathaniel somewhere around the 4th or 5th Tuesday, mostly because Nathaniel was the only person who ever showed up looking genuinely happy to load broken glass into a truck bed. Most folks who came through hauling panels were disposing of them, dropping them off, glad to be rid of the liability. Nathaniel was the opposite, sorting through the pile with the careful attention of a man picking produce at a farmer's market, checking corners for hairline cracks, checking junction boxes for scorch marks, setting aside the ones that looked salvageable and leaving the truly dead ones behind. Fred started setting panels aside for him during the week, a small kindness that saved Nathaniel from having to dig through the whole pile every visit. If stories about grit, family, and the kind of wisdom that grows quietly out of hard ground speak to you, stay with this one until the end. And if you know someone who could use a reminder that patience still pays off, send it their way. To understand why Nathaniel Boyd was dragging broken glass and metal home in the summer heat, you have to understand what kind of ground he was standing on. His farm sat on 62 acres of rolling land in the eastern part of the county, the kind of place where the soil turned to red clay if you dug too deep, and where the wells had always run a little unpredictable, strong in spring, stubborn by August. His grandfather had cleared the first 20 acres by hand. His father had added the rest, piece by piece, trading labor and patience for land, the way farmers in that part of the country always had. Nathaniel had taken it over 11 years earlier, after his father's heart gave out in the middle of a July that everybody still called the bad one. He ran corn on the bottomland and kept a modest herd of cattle on the hill pasture, enough to make the operation work, but never enough to call it easy. His wife, Carol, had died 3 years back, quick and unexpected, the kind of loss that leaves a farmhouse quieter than it has any right to be. Since then, it had just been Nathaniel and his daughter Emmy, who was 16 that summer, and sharp in a way that made teachers nervous, and made Nathaniel proud in a way he rarely said out loud. Carol had been the one who kept the books, who handled the parts of the operation that involved talking to bank managers and insurance adjusters, and anyone else Nathaniel found easier to avoid. She'd also been the one who insisted, every single year without fail, that they set aside money for Emmy's college fund before anything else got paid. An insistence that had made the years since her passing feel doubly hard, because Nathaniel had inherited both the grief and the responsibility of making sure that promise still got kept. He didn't talk about Carol much, not because he'd stopped thinking about her, but because talking about her out loud in front of other people felt like handing a piece of something private over to be handled by hands that hadn't earned it. Emmy understood that about her father without ever needing it explained. She'd learned to read the quiet the way some kids learn to read a clock, knowing exactly what each kind of silence meant, and when it needed company, and when it needed space. Emmy noticed things. She noticed the way her father sat at the kitchen table some nights, doing math on the back of a feed receipt, erasing numbers, writing them again, erasing them a second time. She noticed the pump house behind the barn, the one that ran the irrigation lines out to the bottomland corn, and how her father had started talking about the electric bill the way other men talked about weather they couldn't control. The pumps ran on grid power, same as they always had, and grid power in that part of the state had gotten expensive enough to eat into a season's profit before the corn even tasseled. The county extension agent, a soft-spoken man named Russell Combs, who'd been advising farmers in that district for almost 20 years, had come out in the spring to look at Nathaniel's operation and hadn't had much comfort to offer. "Run the pumps at night when rates dip," he'd said. "Consider cutting back irrigated acreage if the numbers don't work." Nathaniel had nodded along, thanked him for coming, and then asked a question that made Russell pause. "If the sun's out there doing nothing but sitting on my roof all day, why am I paying somebody else for power?" Russell had laughed a little, not unkindly, and said something about solar being expensive to install, panels costing more than a small farm could justify, inverters and batteries running the price up higher still. Nathaniel had nodded again, thanked him, and driven to the recycling center the following Tuesday for the first time. Here's what Nathaniel understood that most people in town hadn't stopped to consider. A cracked solar panel isn't a dead solar panel. If the damage doesn't touch the actual cell grid, and sometimes even if it does a little, the panel can still generate power, just not at full rated output. A panel meant to produce 300 watts might only give you 220 with a cracked corner, or 260 with a scorched junction box that needs rewiring. Commercial solar farms and businesses replace panels the moment output drops below contract specifications, and the old panels get hauled off to recycling centers where they sit, technically waste, actually still capable of doing real work. Nathaniel had spent a winter 3 years earlier reading everything he could find about basic electrical systems, not because he planned anything at the time, but because a slow winter with nothing else to do had left him restless, and Carol used to tease him about disappearing into library books on subjects that had nothing to do with farming. He'd taught himself the difference between series and parallel wiring, how voltage and amperage behave differently depending on how you connect panels together, what a charge controller does and why you need one, how a deep cycle battery bank stores what the sun gives you during the day so you can use it after dark. It wasn't formal training. It was a farmer's version of an engineer's education, built out of stubbornness and library card renewals. That winter, the reading had gone nowhere in particular. He'd fill a spiral notebook with diagrams copied out of library books, sketches of circuits he had no immediate use for, and then the notebook would go into a drawer when calving season started up again, and there wasn't time for anything that didn't involve a heat lamp or a stuck delivery. Carol had found the notebook once, flipping through it at the kitchen table while Nathaniel was out checking the herd, and asked him at supper what exactly he thought he was going to do with 100 pages of solar wiring diagrams on a corn and cattle operation with no solar panels. He'd told her he didn't know yet, just liked understanding how things worked. She'd laughed, not unkindly, and said that was as good a reason as any, and the notebook went back in the drawer, and neither of them thought much more about it until 3 summers later, when the electric bill made the decision for him. By July, he had 60-some-odd panels stacked against the barn, a stack of old truck batteries he'd been collecting from the salvage yard for pocket change, and a plan that existed entirely in his head and on the backs of feed receipts. What he was building that summer wasn't elegant. It was a patchwork system, assembled from panels of different ages, different wattages, different manufacturers, wired together with second-hand cable he'd bought off a retired electrician 2 counties over, and mounted on a frame he welded himself out of old fence posts and angle iron, scavenged from a barn that had partially collapsed the winter before. Emmy caught him out behind the barn on a Saturday morning in early July, sweating through his shirt, wrestling a panel onto a crossbeam by himself. She stood there for a minute before he noticed her. "What is all this?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He set the panel down, wiped his forehead, and looked at the stack still waiting to be mounted. "Going to try something," he said. "Might not work." That was all he gave her. But the next weekend, she was out there with him, not asking questions anymore, just handing him tools and holding panels steady while he bolted them down. Her older cousin, visiting from 2 towns over, thought the whole project looked like a junkyard science fair and said as much more than once. But Emmy stayed quiet and stayed close, the way people do when they've decided to trust something before they fully understand it. The frame itself took the better part of 3 weeks to build, longer than Nathaniel had first expected, because welding angle iron salvaged from a partially collapsed barn meant working with metal that had its own opinions about how straight it wanted to sit. He had to reinforce joints twice after they buckled under the combined weight of panels he was mounting in clusters, and he spent one entire Sunday afternoon simply adjusting the tilt angle of the whole structure, checking it against a chart he'd copied out of one of his old library books, showing the optimal angle for solar collection at his particular latitude during summer months. Emmy took to calling it the ugliest, most expensive-looking cheap thing she'd ever seen, which made Nathaniel laugh for the first time in what felt like weeks. It did look strange, a sprawling, uneven frame of mismatched metal holding 60-some panels of different ages and different manufacturers, some still bearing faded logos from companies that had gone out of business years earlier. But strange and useless were two very different things, and Nathaniel had stopped caring which one the neighbors assumed it was. The first attempt at wiring the array failed within an hour of flipping the switch. Nathaniel had connected panels of mismatched voltage output directly in series, the way you'd wire matching batteries, without accounting for the fact that different panels produce different voltages depending on their age and condition. The mismatch meant the whole string could only perform as well as its weakest panel, and with some panels producing barely half their rated output, the entire array was crawling along at a fraction of what it should have delivered. The charge controller barely registered any meaningful current at all. Nathaniel stood there staring at the readout, jaw tight, saying nothing for a long moment. He went back to his library books that night, the same dog-eared paperbacks and photocopied pamphlets he'd kept in a box in the hall closet for 3 years, and found the section he needed on parallel versus series wiring configurations. Wiring panels in parallel instead of series meant the voltage of the whole array stayed consistent with the healthiest panels, while the current simply added together across all of them. A weak panel wouldn't drag down a strong one the same way. It meant more wiring, more careful attention to connections, more risk of loose joints causing power loss along the way, but it solved the fundamental problem. He spent the better part of 2 weeks rewiring the entire array from scratch, breaking down connections he'd already made and rebuilding them the correct way, sorting his 60-some panels into groups based on condition and output so that similar panels ran together. Emmy helped him label each section with a marker on masking tape, a system that looked almost comically low-tech sitting next to 60 solar panels, but it was the kind of low-tech that actually worked. The second attempt produced power, real measurable power, enough to run a single well pump for a few hours during peak sunlight. But it wasn't enough to sustain irrigation through a full watering cycle, and the battery bank, cobbled together from used truck batteries never designed for this kind of deep cycle work, drained faster than the panels could refill it. By late afternoon, most days, the system had nothing left to give, and Nathaniel was back to flipping the breaker over to grid power just to finish the day's watering. He went back to Russell Combs that August, not for advice this time so much as to ask a specific technical question about battery capacity that had been bothering him for days. Russell, to his credit, didn't laugh at what Nathaniel described. He listened, asked a few clarifying questions of his own, and admitted he didn't have a good answer, but knew an agricultural engineering instructor at the State University Extension Office who might. He gave Nathaniel a phone number. The engineering instructor, a woman named Dr. Patricia Nell, spent 45 minutes on the phone with Nathaniel that same week, walking him through the math on battery bank sizing, the difference between the shallow discharge cycles a truck battery is built for and the deep discharge cycles a solar storage system demands, and the importance of matching battery capacity to actual daily energy needs, rather than just adding batteries until it felt like enough. She recommended he look for used deep cycle marine batteries or golf cart batteries instead, both more suited to the repeated deep drain and recharge cycle solar storage requires, and both available second-hand for a fraction of new pricing if he knew where to look. Nathaniel spent the next 3 weekends trading favors and driving to marinas and golf courses within a 2-hour radius, picking up retired batteries that still had life left in them even if they weren't fit for their original purpose anymore. A marina owner 2 counties south let him haul off a dozen batteries being replaced during a routine fleet upgrade, charging him almost nothing because, as the man put it, he liked seeing somebody actually use the stuff instead of just scrapping it for the lead. The marina owner, a weathered man named Gary Pruitt, who ran a small operation renting pontoon boats to weekend tourists, walked Nathaniel through his own storage shed and let him test each battery with a cheap multimeter before loading it onto the truck, showing him how to check resting voltage and get a rough sense of remaining capacity without any fancy equipment. Half the batteries tested weak enough that Nathaniel left them behind, but the other half still held a respectable charge, retired only because marina insurance policies required fleet batteries to be replaced on a fixed schedule, regardless of actual condition. Gary refused payment twice before finally accepting a case of home-canned tomatoes Emmy had put up that August, calling it a fair trade for batteries that would have gone straight to a scrapyard otherwise. By the time Nathaniel had assembled a battery bank built from a patchwork of marina batteries, golf cart batteries from a course 2 towns over, and a few deep cycle units a retired electrician had sold him for next to nothing, he had something that looked almost nothing like a professional installation, and yet, on paper at least, according to the math Dr. Nell had walked him through, should have had enough storage capacity to carry the well pumps through a full day's irrigation cycle even on cloudy days. By the middle of September, the 3rd version of the system went online. Nathaniel flipped the breaker that morning with Emmy standing beside him, both of them quiet, neither one saying what they were hoping for out loud. The well pump kicked on. The gauge on the charge controller held steady through the morning, dipped a little at midday when clouds rolled through, then climbed back up as the sky cleared. By the time the sun dropped behind the tree line that evening, the pump had run a full irrigation cycle on the bottomland corn without drawing a single kilowatt from the grid. Nathaniel didn't say much. He just stood there for a while, looking at the array of mismatched, second-hand, once-discarded panels mounted on a frame of scavenged fence posts, doing exactly what he'd hoped they would do. Then he turned to Emmy and asked if she wanted to help him figure out how to size a second array for the cattle water pumps. Word got out the way it always does in a small county, slow at first, then all at once. Russell Combs came back out in October, officially this time, clipboard in hand, walking the length of the array asking questions and taking notes with the careful attention of a man recalibrating something he thought he already understood. He said in 20 years of extension work he'd never seen a functional off-grid solar irrigation setup built almost entirely from salvaged, damaged panels on a family farm budget. He asked if he could bring Dr. Nell out the following spring to document the system properly, maybe use it as a teaching example for other farmers in the district. A reporter from the regional paper came out not long after that, walking the property with a photographer, while Nathaniel, uncomfortable in front of a camera, kept trying to redirect the conversation toward Emmy's contribution instead of his own. The story ran on the front page of the paper's Sunday edition, under a headline calling him an ingenious farmer turning waste into power. Nathaniel thought the word ingenious was a stretch. He'd just been trying to keep the water running without going broke doing it. By the time October rolled fully into November, the same neighbors who'd laughed at the sight of a grown man hauling broken glass home every Tuesday started showing up at the farm themselves, not to laugh this time, but to look. They found rows of corn on the bottomland that had come in fuller and greener than corn in the surrounding fields that season. Corn that had gotten consistent irrigation through a stretch of late summer dry weather that had left neighboring farms struggling to keep pace, all without an extra dollar added to Nathaniel's electric bill. One of the older farmers in the group, a man named Delbert Cross, who had farmed in that county for close to 50 years and had been one of the first to make jokes about Nathaniel's Tuesday trips to the recycling center, walked the length of the corn rows without saying much at all. He pulled an ear of corn from the stalk, peeled back the husk, and studied it for a long moment before looking up at Nathaniel. "How much did all this cost you?" he finally asked. Nathaniel told him the number. It was less than a quarter of what a new commercial solar installation would have run. Built almost entirely from panels other people had thrown away and batteries other people had considered spent. Delbert stood there quiet for a while, turning the ear of corn over in his hands like he was looking for something in it he hadn't expected to find. He'd been the one, back in June, who'd told the fellas at the gas station that Boyd's finally lost it, hauling glass home like a man building a greenhouse for ghosts. He didn't apologize for it out loud. Wasn't the kind of man who apologized for much of anything, but he came back out to the farm 3 more times that fall, each visit a little longer than the last, asking more specific questions each time about panel sourcing and battery capacity, and how Nathaniel had figured out the wiring after the first 2 failures. "How much did all this cost you?" he asked again on his 3rd visit. And this time, it wasn't rhetorical. It was the beginning of a real conversation, one that ended with Delbert asking if Nathaniel would be willing to walk him through it sometime, see if something similar might work on his own place. 80 acres of tobacco and hay that had been running the same grid-dependent irrigation setup since Delbert's own father had installed it back in the 70s. Nathaniel said he would. By the following spring, 3 other farms in the county had started their own versions of the same patchwork solar system, built from their own collections of damaged panels and second-hand batteries. All of it traced back to a summer when one man decided that broken didn't necessarily mean useless. There's an old saying among people who work the land, one Nathaniel's father used to repeat when Nathaniel was young and impatient with slow progress. "The ground doesn't care how tired you are. It only cares whether you show up." Nathaniel had shown up every Tuesday that summer, not knowing for certain if any of it would work, not able to explain to a single soul why he was doing what he was doing, driven by nothing more than a stubborn belief that the sun sitting free over his fields every day had to be worth more than what he was paying the electric company for the privilege of not using it. What Nathaniel Boyd built that year wasn't really about solar panels. Panels are just glass and silicon and wiring, useful only if somebody understands how to put them to work. What he actually built was proof that the things a community has learned to see as worthless, whether that's a stack of cracked panels or a man everybody assumed was losing his mind alone on his farm, might still have everything they need left inside them, waiting on someone patient enough to look twice. It's worth saying plainly that none of it happened quickly, and none of it happened without cost that didn't show up on a balance sheet. There were the weeks that summer when Nathaniel came in from the barn after dark, hands cut up from handling cracked glass edges, saying almost nothing at supper because he was turning the day's failures over in his head, trying to find the flaw in the wiring before he fell asleep at the table. There were the mornings Emmy woke up early on her own, without being asked, because she'd started to care about the outcome as much as her father had, in a way that had less to do with electricity and more to do with watching someone she loved refuse to quit on something. There was the quiet, unspoken grief of doing all of it without Carol there to see it finished. Though more than one evening that fall, Nathaniel stood out by the array after Emmy had gone in, looking at the panels catching the last of the light, and said out loud, to nobody in particular, that he thought she would have liked this. Emmy is 17 now, and she's the one who mostly runs the numbers on the second array, the one powering the cattle water system out past the hill pasture. Dr. Nell still calls every few months to check on the system's performance data for her research. Russell Combs brings a new group of extension students out to walk the property every fall, and the panels that once sat cracked and scorched in a recycling yard, headed for a landfill, nobody would have questioned, are still out there behind the barn, quietly turning sunlight into water for corn that used to struggle every August and doesn't anymore. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over that farm in the early evening now, once the pumps shut off on their own, and the light starts to go gold over the bottomland. Nathaniel says it's the same quiet the place always had. And maybe that's true. But Emmy says it feels different, and maybe that's true too. Either way, nobody laughs anymore when they drive past and see the array behind the barn. What used to look like a poor man's junk pile now looks like exactly what it turned out to be. A working answer, built by hand, out of everything everyone else had already given up on. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life who never explained themselves, who just kept showing up and doing the work until the results spoke for them, tell us about them in the comments. We read everyone, and if stories like this one matter to you, stay close because there are more coming.